I am your host, James Morgan, and this is History of Cities. Episode 15 Three's a Crowd. We last left off with the death of. Oh, wait, no, we didn't. This feels like the first time in a long time that the last episode didn't end with the Emperor departing from this world. It almost felt abrupt to cut the last narrative in the middle of Theodosius's reign, but as we have seen and will continue to see, Theodosius was only really ruling in name. It was his sister, Pulcheria, who really ran the empire, and her undisputed control came to an end where we last left off, with the crowning of Theodosius' wife as Augusta. So now Constantinople had two empresses, the insufferably pious virgin Pulcheria and the lively cultured Eudocia. Both women were incredibly bright, and unlike the previous puppet masters, their desire for control over the emperor did not manifest itself as personal greed or cruelty. Outside of their rivalry with each other, they both really wanted the same thing, to be an effective ruler. In Pulcheria's case, this meant spreading the love of God through the city by building churches, giving charitably, and building a new district of housing for the poor that was named after her. In Eudocia's case, this meant the cultivation of knowledge through the funding of new schools in Constantinople. In truth, both empresses were good for the empire, and likely respected the work that the other did in the capital, but their animosity grew from the simple seed of jealousy. Pulcheria was jealous that her student had been proclaimed her equal, at least in imperial rank, and feared that Eudocia could usurp the power she held over her brother. Eudocia was jealous of Pulcheria's relationship with Theodosius. Though it was never implied that anything incestuous had occurred, it was clear to see that the emperor greatly respected his sister's counsel, and was in some ways closer to her than his own wife. This jealousy was likely fed just by the difference in personality between the two women. Pulcheria had turned the imperial court into something that had resembled a monastery, which was a sharp contrast to the days of hedonism and revelry under her mother's reign. Into this drab, cloistered world, Eudocia had swept like a fresh spring air. She was not debauched, though in Pulcheria's eyes any bit of fun was akin to the most disgusting sin, but her Hellenic spirit cut through the fog of the conservative court. As resentment continued to boil between the two empresses, an event in the summer of 423 would distract them from their rivalry, at least for a little while. This event was the arrival of the Augusta of the West, the daughter of Theodosius the Great, the half-sister of Emperor Honorius, the Empress Placidia. Her trip to Constantinople was not one of leisure, but one spawned out of the necessity of escaping the suffocating presence of her half-brother. Up until this point, Placidia had endured a real roller coaster of a life. Even though she was the aunt of Pulcheria and the aunt-in-law of Eudocia, she was only 30 years old, less than a decade older than her two nieces. Still, at this young age, she had already been widowed twice and had been thoroughly caught up in the absolute chaos that was the Western Roman Empire. She had survived the 3 brutal Visigoth sieges of Rome, but had been taken captive by Alaric during his final sack of the city. As their prisoner, she traveled with the Gothic host to Gaul, where they made an alliance with Honorius to defeat the usurping Roman emperors located in the western provinces of the empire. At this time, Alaric had died and had been succeeded by a man named Aetolf, who sought to cement his alliance with Honorius by marrying Placidia. She was only 15 years old when she was married off to this barbarian king, but she wouldn't have to bear this humiliation for long. Only a year after they were married, Aetolf was assassinated, and a quick succession crisis ensued in the Visigoth ranks, which Placidia was lucky to survive. Eventually, the Gothic host made their way back to Italy, where they made a deal with a governor there to give them supplies in return for handing Placidia back to the Romans. This governor's name was Constantius III, and in a short time he would become Placidia's second husband. They were only married for 4 years, but in this time Placidia would bear 2 children, a girl and a boy, and she would be named Augusta when Constantius was raised by Honorius to be co-emperor of the West. Constantius only served as co-emperor for 6 months before he died of an illness and left Placidia and her children in the care of her brother's imperial court. It was at this time that Honorius began exhibiting romantic intentions towards his sister, which she naturally rebuked. This led to Honorius becoming more mentally unhinged and openly hostile towards the young Augusta. Finally, in 423, in fear for her and her children's lives, she fled the imperial court in Ravenna and made for Constantinople. Now Placidia was not very close with her family in the east. In fact, they had never met each other, and Theodosius had never accepted her as Augusta of the West. However, she did offer an interesting prospect to the court of Constantinople. Honorius had no children and had divorced his only wife, stripping her of all imperial rank. This meant that if he died soon, the next in line to rule the Western Empire would be Placidia and her infant son Valentinian. And lo and behold, just a few months after arriving in the capital, Placidia received news that Honorius had indeed died. Now the three empresses met with their puppet emperor and planned a reunification of the Roman Empire. It was at this time that Theodosius finally accepted Placidia's title as Augusta and raised the 4-year-old Valentinian to the rank of Caesar. They also made plans for Eudocia and Theodosius's daughter to marry Valentinian when they came of age, thus reinforcing the familial connections between the two halves of the empire. There was just one little problem they had to overcome. While these plans were being drawn up in Constantinople, the court in Ravenna saw the delay in naming a successor and the absence of Placidia as a chance to nominate their own man to be emperor. They chose Johannes, chief of the notaries, basically the head pencil pusher, to be the new Augustus of the West. The three empresses were in agreement that this could not stand, and they persuaded Theodosius to prepare an army to escort Placidia back to Italy. After just 2 years in the capital, it was time for Placidia to sail back west and claim the throne. So in 425, she did just that, with very little bloodshed. Of course, Johannes was executed for daring to question Placidia's place as ruler of the West, and the city of Ravenna likewise was looted by the Byzantine army as recompense for its role in supporting the usurper. Having successfully installed the imperial family back in the Western Empire, the soldiers made their way back to Constantinople, laden with the treasure of Ravenna. It is at this point that Placidia will drop out of our story, and I will just sum up the rest of her time as Augusta of the West. The Empress would continue to rule her half of the empire, unquestioned for the next 12 years. She will have to deal with rivals in her court, as well as the ongoing issues that plagued the Western Empire, rotting it from the inside while simultaneously battering it from without. Finally, in 437, her principal rival, a man named Aetius, would take her place as the most powerful voice in the imperial court. She would continue to be a strong influence over her son until her death in 450, but her position as unassailable empress would never again be regained. Returning to Constantinople, the rivalry between Pulcheria and Eudocia had picked up right where they had left off 2 years ago, when Placidia's plight had taken precedence. At this point, in 425, Eudocia was at the zenith of her influence over Theodosius, and she used this opportunity to conspire with the Praetorian prefect of Constantinople to improve the city's educational system. Her crowning achievement was the establishment of the University of Constantinople, founded in 425 by the name Pandidactarium, which roughly translates to place of teaching for all subjects. Historians credit Theodosius for the founding of this school, but it was clear to everyone whose creation it really was. The empress was famous for her love of knowledge. The new university had 31 chairs, with 16 of them being designated as Greek and the rest assigned as Latin. This shows the gradual Hellenization that the Eastern Empire was undergoing. Of these 31 chairs, the most important were those of law, philosophy, and rhetoric, which provided students with the tools necessary to be effective politicians and bureaucrats. Unlike most places in the world at this time, the Eastern Empire saw education as the bedrock foundation for a stable society, and so it emphasized universal learning for both sexes and opened primary education to the masses, even those who labored in poor villages. While Eudocia enjoyed the fruits of her ascendancy within the imperial court, Pulcheria stewed on the sidelines, biding her time and looking for any opportunity to undermine the woman she had once seen as her student. It is really a shame that the two empresses could not coexist, as I don't believe that they were very different in terms of policy. They both supported institutions that they believed would benefit the people of Constantinople the best. For Pulcheria, that was the Christian church and their charitable systems. For Eudocia, that was the education system. It wasn't that Eudocia didn't support the church, or that Pulcheria hated the schools and universities. The rivalry was more personal than professional. Of course, Theodosius was no help. Had he been a stronger personality, he could have acted as a bridge between his sister and his wife, but instead, he tended to side with whoever was closest to him at the time, and provided no real input of his own. This indecisiveness was exactly the problem that had plagued Constantine and Constantius when the question of the Arian heresy threatened the religion the state was built on top of. Their waffling between either side of the argument perpetuated the crisis beyond what was necessary. It had taken Theodosius the Great and the Ecumenical Council of Constantinople finally laying out concrete boundaries to mitigate the schism. Now during the reign of a perpetual pushover, another religious crisis was beginning to form. The revised Nicene Creed had made it completely clear that Jesus Christ was the Son of God and was a part of God, but some Christians still had trouble squaring the idea that a manifestation of the all-powerful God could be harmed and even killed by mortal hands. They could not argue that Christ was separate from God anymore. That had been declared heretical by the First Council of Constantinople. But in 427, a new bishop of Constantinople was appointed, and he had a revolutionary loophole that he professed. This bishop was named Nestorius, and his big new idea was that Jesus was actually two people, one mortal and the other immortal. Without getting too much into the weeds of theological theory, I want to try and clarify exactly what Nestorius and his followers believed were the mechanics of Jesus' being. They believed that Jesus was a normal human man, and at the moment of his immaculate conception, he was latched onto by a piece of God's being called Logos. At the risk of offending Christians and sounding a little grotesque, we can imagine Logos as a sort of benign tumor on Jesus' soul. It is attached to him, but also not a natural growth, and thus separate from him. I don't know if that makes this whole situation any clearer, but the gist of it is that the Nestorians had found a way to reconcile the Nicene Creed to Arianism. Nestorius' teachings quickly spread through the empire, and Theodosius, as usual, accepted whatever was closest to him, and so supported the Bishop of Constantinople. This position is unique, as one of the few times Theodosius took a position that was not supported by either his wife or his sister. It was quite rare that the two empresses agreed on something, and when they did, Theodosius usually followed their lead, but not this time. Pulcheria in particular was a rabid detractor of Nestorius, as part of the bishop's argument for the two-person Christ was the de-emphasis of the role of Mary in the Christian faith. He argued against the use of the title Theotokos, or Mother of God, as he saw Mary simply as the mother of the human part of Jesus. Pulcheria's entire identity revolved around her being the Virgin Empress. In some sense, she saw herself as the mother of the Byzantine Empire, and thus was akin to the Virgin Mother of Jesus Christ. An attack on Mary's position was like an attack on her, and so Pulcheria became the most avid opponent of the Nestorian position. She put her considerable talent and power to work organizing opposition to Nestorius. Her most powerful ally in this fight was the Patriarch of Alexandria, a man named Cyril. Despite the growing influence of Constantinople as the predominant Eastern Christian city, Alexandria still held a prominent role in the Orthodox hierarchy. Cyril managed to leverage this position to convince Theodosius to call for a council in Ephesus to rule on the conflict. If the emperor had been expecting this to be a well-mannered church gathering to settle doctrinal differences, he would have been sorely disappointed. Cyril put the considerable resources of Alexandria to work, bribing clergymen and bureaucrats, until he was firmly in control of the council's proceedings. He had himself declared president for the first council of Ephesus, and before Nestorius or many other delegates had even arrived, he had the council declare his teachings anathema. Theodosius, who had sworn to uphold the findings of the council, was forced to strip Nestorius of his position and would later banish him from Constantinople. With his rival completely out of the picture, Cyril was able to enshrine everything he believed into the canon. The Ephesus Council decreed that Jesus was one person, with two natures, divine and mortal. Now wait, you might be saying, isn't that what Nestorians believe? I can see why you would be confused, but actually Nestorians believe that Jesus was two people with two separate natures, and that is heretical. If you want any further examples of how minute and specific doctrinal quibbles were, there was a split almost immediately after the council between those that believed as Cyril did in two natures, one person, and those believed in one nature, one person. What a headache. But to the Christians, this was more than a question of life or death. Church orthodoxy was a matter of one's eternal soul, and being caught on the wrong side of one of these councils would find your afterlife prospects quickly spiraling down the toilet. While this whole debacle in the church was going down in Ephesus, back in Constantinople, the political situation had been shifting. The relationship between the emperor and his wife had been gradually degrading, and Eudocia found that she no longer held the closest spot to Theodosius. Her husband had always felt that Eudocia was perhaps a little too smart and beautiful to be truly faithful to him, and it didn't help that he had Pulcheria whispering rumors in his ear. As Eudocia saw that her place at court was becoming precarious, she began looking for a way to put some space between her and her jealous husband. Her chance came in 438 when her daughter married the Western Emperor Valentinian III, as had been arranged way back in 423 with Placidia's trip to Constantinople. Eudocia had vowed at that time that if her daughter became Augusta of the West, she would take a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, and so in 438 she did just that. She was gone from the capital for a full year and planned her trip around two goals. One was to do what her predecessor Helena had done and travel the Holy Land in search of religious relics to bring back to Constantinople. Her second goal was more personal. She sought to reconcile the Christians and the pagans within the empire so that both could peacefully coexist. She had been born a pagan but baptized as a Christian. She found admirable qualities in both circles and wanted the rest of the empire to benefit from their cooperation. Indeed, her university in Constantinople had been a massive success in this regard, as it was officially a Christian institution that also taught the pagan scholars that made up most of the empire's philosophy and literature. Eudocia wanted to build off this initial success in the East's most important Christian city at the time, Antioch. We saw in our episode covering Julian that Antioch had a uniquely mixed population of Christians and pagans, and both religions viewed the city as historically significant to their people. Eudocia gained the support of the Antiochians by personally funding a revitalization and expansion of the city, and in return the citizens fully embraced her ideals of Christian Hellenism. Upon returning to Constantinople, it seemed like the time apart had healed some of the injuries Theodosius and Eudocia's marriage had sustained. On top of that, Eudocia saw her trip as a wild success in terms of both her goals, as she had managed to bring back several venerated relics and spread the idea of religious cohabitation. Always energetic and bright, she wanted to build on this success by having her husband institute policies that protected pagans and Jews from persecution and promoted education even further out in the provinces. At this time, the university in Constantinople completed a monumental task that it had been working on for years. This task was the compilation of the Codex Theodosianus, or Theodosian Code. The code laid out a set of laws that had been promulgated by various emperors since the reign of Constantine, more than a century's worth of legal policy. The purpose of the code was not just to smooth out the chaotic mess of legal precedents, it also sought to bring together the Western and Eastern empires that had been drifting apart for decades. The code mentions both Rome and Constantinople as capitals of the empire, and it was written in Latin instead of Greek so as to not alienate the Westerners. As Theodosius hoped to bring the political and legal parts of the Roman Empire together, he also hoped to use the document to codify Christian orthodoxy and its role in the policy making of the empire. The Theodosian Code managed to achieve all these ambitious goals when both Theodosius and Valentinian accepted it, though its unifying power was ephemeral. Still, Eudocia was doubtlessly proud that the institution she had helped bring into being had created something so important. Not only was the Codex important in its time, but modern historians have used it to better understand the foundational ideas of the late Roman Empire. Unfortunately, this return to the halcyon days would be brief, as Theodosius's jealousy was again inflamed by Pulcheria. This time, Pulcheria would be successful in permanently splitting up the imperial couple by engineering proof of an affair between Eudocia and Theodosius's longtime friend Paulinus. Eudocia was forced to flee the capital, and her alleged lover was executed. She made her way back to Jerusalem in 443 and would remain there for the rest of her life. Even though Eudocia never returned to Constantinople, she would continue to write, teach, and discuss religious matters in Jerusalem, becoming a very influential intellectual in her own right, without the need to pull at her husband's puppet strings. She was probably also happy to be out of the capital, which was dealing with yet another foreign threat. This time from the Huns and their new leader, someone I'm sure many of you have heard of, the dreaded Attila. The Scourge of God, as Attila was called, had succeeded to the throne of the barbarian horde in 434. Upon becoming king of the Huns, Attila immediately doubled the annual tribute Theodosius had been paying to keep the barbarians from raiding the Eastern Empire. The same year that Eudocia settled down in Jerusalem, Attila decided that the tribute was not sufficient and sent his armies to pillage southern Greece while simultaneously besieging Constantinople. Eudocia was likely not bothered by the news of this development, as her daughter was safe in the west, she was safe in the Levant, and she certainly didn't care what happened to Pulcheria and Theodosius. The people of Constantinople were not as calm about the situation, but luckily for them, the Theodosian walls proved too much of an obstacle for the Huns to overcome, and so they left the capital untouched while they extracted all the wealth from the surrounding land. With the Roman armies on campaign in Africa, Attila was given free rein over the Balkans and Greece, until finally Theodosius recollected his troops in the capital to rid his lands of the scourge. In response, Attila marched his armies back east to assault Constantinople and put the Romans in their place. He obliterated a Roman army outside the city and destroyed another waiting in reserve outside the town of Gallipoli. With both his armies in ruins, Theodosius was forced to sue for peace on extremely unfavorable terms. Attila was able to extract from the emperor an extremely lopsided trade agreement in exchange for a 1-year truce. This humiliating defeat to a so-called barbarian army shook the foundations of the Roman military's mythos and left the capital wondering when the scourge of God would come for them. But Attila respected his side of the bargain, and the Huns retreated back across the Danube, leaving the Byzantine lands in peace, at least for a while. Then, in the year 447, Attila was already preparing to make another trip to Constantinople when he received word that an earthquake in January had destroyed a massive section of the Theodosian walls. He knew that he would never get a better opportunity to sack the imperial capital, and so his armies swiftly crossed the Danube and made their way southward to Constantinople. Before they could reach the city, they met the last hope of the Eastern Roman Empire in what is now Bulgaria. This last hope was a force consisting of 3 field armies, including the emperor's personal army, the army of Thrace, and the army of Illyria. In total, they consisted of over 70,000 men. If they could not stop Attila here, then there would be no one between the Huns and Constantinople. Exact details of the battle are not known. This is likely because the Romans, much more than the Huns, were the documentarians of such battles, and there were none of them left after the fighting to tell the tale. The Romans did not go down without a fight, and the little of what we do know about the battle tells us that while the Huns were able to completely annihilate their opponents, they too suffered the worst casualties they had ever seen in a pitched battle. Still, they had enough troops and siege weapons left to continue on to Constantinople, whose fate now lay in the hands of 2 men. These men were named Constantius and Zeno. Constantius was the praetorian prefect of the East. When Constantinople heard the news that the Huns were preparing to invade in 447, he had mustered the population of the city to perform an unprecedented feat of construction by repairing the massive damage in the Theodosian walls in under 2 months. They accomplished this task just in time, but the walls would be completely useless against Attila's siege machines if there were no soldiers to man the defenses. That is where Zeno comes in. Zeno was the commander-in-chief of the Eastern Army and originated from the rough terrain of Inner Anatolia, a region called Isauria. He was chosen to lead the defense of Constantinople because he was the closest military commander to the capital at that point, and time was not on the city's side. He brought with him a large contingent of his kinsmen from Isauria to mount the defense and hopefully repulse the invasion. When Attila saw the newly rebuilt walls and the soldiers manning them, he knew that a siege was hopeless. Despite this hopelessness, he was able to use the threat of a siege to force Theodosius into an even more humiliating peace agreement, which saw the emperor pay the scourge an immediate sum of 6,000 pounds of gold, along with a new yearly tribute of 2,100 pounds of gold. This deal effectively drained the imperial treasury of all its resources and nearly led the Eastern Empire into economic ruin. But the deal achieved its purpose for Theodosius, as Attila turned west and would never bother the Byzantines again. So with the end of the Hunnic threat, we arrive to the momentous year of 450, which saw Theodosius involved in a horse-riding accident that claimed his life, and later in November Placidia died, leaving her son to rule without her. With Eudocia relegated to the periphery in Jerusalem, this left Pulcheria, the first and last of the 3 empresses. She ruled the Byzantine Empire alone for only a month, before she thought it would be more prudent to choose a new emperor that she could control. She chose a lowly personal assistant of one of the top-ranking generals, a man named Marcian. Pulcheria married him on the 25th of November, 450, on the condition that her vow of virginity be respected. In Marcian, she found a much more aggressive partner than what she had dealt with for the first 36 years of her reign. Where she had worn Theodosius like a pair of silk gloves, Marcian was a hammer that could break anything that stood in her way. Immediately after Marcian was proclaimed Augustus, he annulled the peace treaty that Theodosius had signed with the Huns. The imperial court had solid intelligence that Attila was preparing to attack the Western Empire. Marcian reasoned that the Huns would not want to split their forces to deal with the defiant Byzantines, and so their refusal to pay the scourge would go unpunished. Their prediction was right, and Attila marched west with his whole host, never to return to the Eastern Empire. Marcian's gamble paid off in a big way, and he was able to pull the empire back from the verge of bankruptcy. But as always, there was never just one crisis affecting the empire at this time. Pulcheria and her husband would have to quickly move on from thinking about the Huns to dealing with the church once again. It makes Pulcheria's decision to remain a virgin for her entire life much more sympathetic when you consider how all the clergymen around her constantly acted like quarreling children. Who needs kids of your own when you have the Christian church to deal with? This time, the conflict within the faith came from something I mentioned earlier in this episode. The first council at Ephesus had confirmed the idea that Christ was one person as orthodoxy. It had also confirmed that this one person had two natures, one human and one divine. Then, in 448, an elderly and influential abbot in Constantinople named Eutyches began preaching about a version of Christ that had only one nature, or monophysite. This nature was uniquely his, neither human or divine. His ideas quickly spread among the faithful in Constantinople, and from there out into the wider empire, even finding a sympathetic figure in Jerusalem with Eudocia, who joined her local monophysites in a revolt against the prevailing orthodoxy. Before his death, Theodosius had tried to smother this heresy by having the Archbishop of Constantinople, who was named Flavian, hold a synod to determine the fate of Eutyches. They found him guilty of heresy and stripped him of his rank in the church. Eutyches appealed to the Pope in Rome to overturn his expulsion, and Pope Leo I called on Theodosius to hold another ecumenical council. The emperor complied, and the Second Council of Ephesus was convened in 449. The primary question brought to the council was not whether monophysitism or miaphysitism was orthodox, but whether Archbishop Flavian had wrongfully excommunicated Eutyches or not. The proceedings were lengthy and heated. By the time they finally came to a conclusion, Theodosius had died, and the control of the council lay entirely in the prosecution's hands. This prosecution was led by the Patriarch of Alexandria, a man named Dioscorus, who had succeeded Cyril in 444. Again, we see the dioceses of Alexandria and Constantinople facing off against each other at an ecumenical council, begging the question as to whether these proceedings were entirely focused on church matters, or if there was an underlying political reasoning for them. Whatever the reasoning, Dioscorus got his way, and Archbishop Flavian was condemned for hastily excommunicating Eutyches. In the heat of the moment, 1,000 monks, supposed men of God, rushed Flavian, who threw himself on the altar in a vain attempt to protect himself. They beat him and whipped him mercilessly. After this savage attack, he was sent into exile, but would soon die of his wounds. This just goes to show how seriously some people took politics in the church, that they would be willing to kill just because someone had made a minor mistake. Pope Leo I was horrified when he learned that Flavian had been martyred, and was disgusted by the dishonesty of the prosecution in the proceedings of the trial. He declared the Second Council of Ephesus to be a robber council, and called upon the emperor to convene a new council. At this time, Marcian and Pulcheria were in charge, and they chose to have the council convene closer to the capital to project imperial influence onto the proceedings. In order to maintain the veneer of impartialness, it was not held in Constantinople, but just across the Bosporus Strait in Chalcedon. The Fourth Ecumenical Council that convened in Chalcedon in 451 was the largest to date, with over 500 bishops from both the Eastern and Western empires showing up to weigh in on the issues at hand. Remarkably, despite the variety of opinions represented at the council, it was able to come to a definitive conclusion on every issue that was brought up. In the case of monophysitism versus miaphysitism, the council decreed that Christ had two natures, which were defined as the Godhead and manhood. Anything contrary to this was heresy and punishable by excommunication. On top of finally putting this doctrinal debate to rest, the council ruled on a series of 30 disciplinary canons, of which we only really need to highlight one. This one is known as Canon 28, and it decreed that, quote, "The Bishop of Constantinople shall enjoy the same privileges as the Bishop of Rome," end quote. Now up to this point, I have referred to the archbishops of Constantinople and Alexandria as patriarchs, but it wasn't until the Council of Chalcedon that this position became official. Additionally, the title of patriarch will not exist for almost another century until Justinian creates it in 531. It is just easier to refer to these archbishops as patriarch to highlight the political importance of these church positions, even if it isn't totally accurate to call them that. But now with Canon 28, it becomes official Christian policy that the religious leaders of both the Eastern and Western empires are, for all intents and purposes, equals. It also placed Constantinople above its traditional rivals of Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem as the most important Christian city in the East. Despite the body of the Council of Chalcedon widely representing the views of the entire Christian world, the findings of said body would be the principal causes of the most schisms in church history since the rise of Arianism. For this reason, the council is often referred to as Chalcedon, the ominous. From the immediate to the distant future, rulings in this council will irrevocably fracture and weaken the Christian world. It is a shame that this disastrous council is the last chapter in Pulcherius the Pious's illustrious 39-year de facto reign. She was able to reconcile with Eudocia in the final year of her life and allowed her sister-in-law to remain in Augusta and even allowed her back into the Orthodox Church after she renounced Monophysitism. Finally, in 453, at the age of 54, Pulcheria died and the age of the three empresses came to an end. Please join me next time as we see how Marcian will get along ruling the empire without his domineering wife. As always, if you have any questions or think I missed anything, please feel free to email me at hofcpod.cast@gmail.com or DM me on Twitter at HOFC_podcast. Thank you for listening to this episode, and please join me next time for the history of Constantinople.